Why was she the only one standing in the rain that morning? The others had already moved on, scattered across the base yard, joking, smoking, pretending the day was just another line in their service record. But Sarah Martinez stayed behind. Her boots sank slightly into the wet gravel. The air smelled of oil and gunmetal. A thin Colorado mist blurred the mountains beyond Fort Carson's fences, softening the edges of everything, except the ache in her chest. She joined the army to belong somewhere, to matter, to prove that strength wasn't a question of gender or size or birthplace. And yet, in that moment, standing alone in formation after everyone else had gone, she felt invisible. Maybe that's what hurt most. Not the shouting, not the extra duties, not even the exhaustion that clawed at her every night. What hurt was being unseen by the people she had bled and trained beside. But she didn't know then that every quiet endurance, every silent humiliation was being watched. Someone, somewhere, had already noticed her, and that notice would change everything. Sarah's story didn't begin on that cold parade ground. It began years earlier, beneath the wide Texas sky where the smell of mesquite wood and dust filled the air, and her grandfather's old army medals caught the morning sun like tiny mirrors. She was 7 when she first asked him what courage meant. "It's not a word," he'd said, polishing the dull metal of a bronze star with his calloused hands. "It's a choice, every day when you feel small and do the right thing anyway." He'd served in Vietnam, came home with scars no one could see. Sometimes, when the world got too quiet, Sarah would find him sitting by the window, staring at the fields behind their house, as if counting ghosts. It was those moments that shaped her. When other kids dreamed of college or city lights, Sarah dreamed of service, of discipline, of a place where purpose had rules and sacrifice meant something. At 18, she signed the papers without hesitation. Basic training hit like a storm, but Sarah didn't bend. She ran until her lungs burned, fired until her shoulder bruised, crawled through mud and wire until every muscle screamed. And still, she got up again. The instructors learned her name not because she was loud, but because she never stopped moving. When she was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment at Fort Carson, she felt like she'd finally arrived at the place her grandfather used to talk about. A family bound by discipline and duty. The mountains were sharp and bright against the blue Colorado sky. The mornings were cold enough to make her breath steam as she laced her boots. Everything about the place hummed with purpose. She found friends quickly. Marcus, the quiet Detroit mechanic who could fix anything with wire and patience. Jenny, the medic with California sunshine in her laugh. And Tom, the squad leader who carried 8 years of service in his eyes, always steady, always watching. They trained together, ate together, built a rhythm. Days turned to weeks, and Sarah's name climbed the performance charts. She wasn't the strongest, but she was the most relentless. Her aim, her focus, her willingness to do the extra rep when no one watched, it earned respect. For a while, everything felt right. Until the day she met Sergeant First Class Robert Harrison, Bull, they called him. He was a man built out of brick and silence. His voice had the gravel of too many cigarettes, and his stare could pin anyone to the floor. 12 years in the Army had hardened him into something immovable. And he didn't like change. Especially not her. At first it was subtle. Extra duties, late-night cleaning when others rested, assignments that conveniently kept her away from team drills, nothing overt enough to challenge, but enough to send a message. She tried to ignore it, told herself it was a test, another endurance drill. The Army taught resilience, didn't it? Keep your head down, follow orders, earn respect the hard way. But every day, the line blurred between discipline and cruelty. During briefings, he'd question her decisions louder than anyone else's. During exercises, he'd correct her posture with words that cut deeper than any blow. The others noticed, but silence was safer. No one wanted to be next. One evening in the mess hall, Jenny slid onto the bench beside her. "Don't let him get inside your head," she said, pushing a tray toward her. "Guys like Bull, if you stop standing tall, they win." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I'm fine." She was. That night she wrote in her journal, the one she kept hidden beneath her bunk. "He doesn't want me to fail. He wants me gone. But I can't leave. If I quit, then every woman behind me loses a little ground too." She didn't know anyone would one day read those words in a courtroom. The harassment grew sharper as the deployment deadline approached. The battalion was preparing for Afghanistan, 6 months out, and the stress pressed down on everyone. Mistakes drew fire, tempers flared, and Bull found new reasons to undermine her. During one exercise, her fire team cleared a mock village with textbook precision. The after-action timer blinked green, record time. But before the dust settled, Bull's voice thundered across the field. "Showboating again, Martinez. You think this is a damn movie set." The words hit harder than any round. Around her, soldiers froze, glancing between them. They'd all seen her perfection, but no one moved. No one contradicted a senior sergeant. Later, alone in the armory, she cleaned her rifle with trembling hands. Not from anger, from the effort to hold it back. She could have filed a complaint. There were channels for that. But complaints have a way of echoing through ranks, and the labeled troublemaker could end a career faster than a bullet. So she stayed silent, until silence became its own kind of wound. The breaking point came on a gray morning during inspection. The squad lined up in formation, boots polished, rifles ready. Bull paced in front, his eyes like cold steel cutting through every line. When he stopped before Sarah, she felt the air change. He looked her over slowly, searching for an error that wasn't there. Her uniform was perfect, her stance textbook, but Bull's mouth curved, not in satisfaction but in cruelty. "Front-leaning rest," he barked. "Push-up position." She obeyed instantly, palms pressed into the pavement. 1, he counted slowly, 2. Minutes passed, then 5, then 10. Her arms began to shake, but she didn't falter. The formation grew silent, unease rippling down the line. Sweat darkened her collar, the gravel bit into her palms. Still she held. Bull's voice cut through the air. "Weak. You think you belong here. You're just pretending, Martinez." A muscle in Marcus's jaw twitched. He took half a step forward before Tom's voice stopped him, low and sharp. "Don't. He'll drag you down too." 15 minutes, 20. When Bull finally said, "Recover," Sarah pushed herself up on shaking arms. Her eyes met his just once. She didn't blink. That defiance, quiet, unspoken, was the first time she truly fought back. But the price would come later. That night she couldn't sleep. Every muscle screamed. The humiliation clung to her like the smell of oil. She sat by the barracks window, staring out at the empty yard. Somewhere across the courtyard, a shadow moved, someone watching. She didn't notice. And because she didn't, she never knew that her endurance that morning had just lit a fuse. Over the next weeks, the harassment grew methodical, deliberate. Bull began assigning her the dirtiest duties: grease traps, latrine scrubbing, night shifts no one else wanted. He said it was to build discipline. Everyone knew better. Sleep came in fragments. Meals, sometimes not at all. Jenny and Marcus did what they could, saving food, covering shifts, but their help had limits. Tom tried reasoning with Bull once. "Ease up on her, Sarge, she's solid." Bull just smiled. "You worry about your job, I'll worry about mine." By the time the mountain exercise arrived, Sarah was running on nerves and caffeine. The unit was simulating a high-altitude patrol. The air was thin, the terrain brutal. When Bull appeared unannounced halfway through the drill, everyone's pulse spiked. He didn't come to observe, he came to break her. During a rest stop, he called her over, claiming her gear wasn't secured. Then the shouting began, sharp, public, designed to humiliate. His words carried across the slope like rifle cracks. Sarah stood at attention, eyes forward, throat tight. Every insult hit its mark. Then came the order. Low crawl, now across that rock bed. The ground was jagged, laced with thorns. It wasn't part of the drill, everyone knew it. Still, she dropped to the ground. The first scrape tore through her sleeve, then another. The rocks bit into her skin, slicing her knees, her elbows. Each movement left a mark, a tiny crimson trail. But she kept crawling. Every inch forward was defiance, every cut a promise, you won't break me. The squad watched in silence, torn between loyalty and fear. Marcus's fists clenched. "This is wrong," he hissed. "Don't," Tom whispered again. "Not yet." Bull walked beside her, boots crunching, voice dripping poison. "You like this, Martinez. You want equality, here it is. Bleed for it." She reached the end of the rock field and stood, bloody, shaking, but upright. And something inside Bull snapped. "You think you're tough," he snarled, stepping close. "Answer me." She didn't, she couldn't. To respond would be to break rank, and that silence, that discipline, infuriated him beyond reason. A heartbeat passed, too. Then his leg moved. A single savage kick. The boot struck her temple with a sound that silenced the mountains. The world tilted, the sky spun. Then nothing. For a few seconds, no one moved. Marcus was the first. He sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside her crumpled body. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark against the dust. "Medic," he screamed. Jenny was already running, med kit in hand. Tom's voice cracked across the field. "What the hell did you just do?" Bull froze. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something like disbelief. "She fell," he muttered. "She slipped." "No, she didn't," Marcus snapped. "We all saw you." Jenny's hands moved fast, gauze, pressure, flashlight to the pupils. Concussion, possible fracture, pulse weak. Her voice trembled, but her hands didn't. Within minutes, the radio calls went out. Medevac inbound. Soldiers from nearby units arrived, drawn by the chaos. Cameras, witnesses, the story spreading like wildfire before the helicopter even touched down. Bull's career ended the moment that rotor washed over them. He just didn't know it yet. As the medics lifted Sarah's still body onto the stretcher, Jenny shouted over the roar, "She's not breathing right. Move." Marcus stepped back, eyes burning. Somewhere inside him, something shifted forever. As the helicopter rose into the thin mountain air, every soldier on that slope watched. None spoke. The sound faded into distance, swallowed by the wind. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew it. Nothing about their battalion or their lives would ever be the same again. Why was the base so quiet the next morning? Fort Carson was never silent, not really. There were always boots striking pavement, orders echoing, engines humming from the motor pool. But that morning, the silence felt heavy, like something sacred had been broken, and everyone was afraid to move. The news had spread faster than any order ever could. Bull kicked her. 3 words whispered through barracks halls, cafeteria lines, locker rooms. Soldiers repeated it in disbelief, some denying, others already certain. They'd all seen her, Private Martinez, the one who never complained, the one who earned her place the hard way. And now she was gone. Jenny didn't sleep that night. Her hands still smelled faintly of blood and antiseptic. She could see Sarah's head snapping back over and over again, replaying in her mind with perfect clarity, a horror loop that wouldn't stop. She sat on her bunk, staring at her boots. Beside her, Marcus paced like a caged animal. "She's alive," he kept muttering. "She has to be." Tom sat across the room, his face pale, eyes hollow. He'd seen bad things before, field injuries, training accidents, even a suicide once, but never this. Never something that felt chosen. Bull hadn't snapped under combat pressure. He wasn't protecting anyone. He'd made a choice. And choices had consequences. The medevac helicopter reached the hospital in less than 20 minutes. The doctors at Fort Carson's field clinic stabilized her just long enough for the transfer to Walter Reed. Her file moved through channels faster than paperwork usually could, stamped priority in bold red ink. For 3 days, Sarah drifted somewhere between consciousness and nothing. Sometimes in the fog she thought she heard voices. A woman whispering, maybe her mother, the steady beep of machines. Once, she dreamed she was back in the desert training range, crawling through rocks again, but this time the stones were soft and the air didn't hurt. When she finally woke, the first thing she saw was light, white, sterile, steady. Then her mother's face. "Sarah," she whispered, her hand trembling on her daughter's arm. "Honey, you're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign. Her throat was raw, her head bandaged, and when she tried to move, pain shot like lightning through her skull. The world tilted. Machines beeped faster. A nurse hurried in, gentle but firm. "You're in Walter Reed, Private Martinez. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Don't move too fast." Sarah blinked, forcing the fog away. Her voice came out cracked. 3 days. Her father stood near the door, arms folded, jaw locked tight. He was a retired cop, the kind of man who'd faced down drunks and gunmen and broken lives for 30 years. But now he looked ready to break himself. "They told us it was a training accident," he said flatly. "That you slipped, hit your head." His wife's eyes filled with tears. "But we know better, don't we?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The tremor in her hands spoke for her. Back at Fort Carson, the story had already reached the command offices. Colonel James Mitchell sat behind his desk, staring at the incident report. It was precise, clinical, words stripped of emotion. During mountain training, Private S. Martinez sustained a head injury due to accidental fall on uneven terrain. Sergeant First Class R. Harrison was present. A lie dressed in regulation ink. Mitchell exhaled slowly, fingers tightening on the paper. He'd heard whispers for months about Harrison, the discipline complaints, the morale issues. But whispers were easy to ignore when deployments loomed and paperwork piled high. Now those whispers had become a scream. He pressed the intercom, "Send Harrison in." The door opened 5 minutes later. Bull entered, uniform crisp, eyes bloodshot. "Sir." Mitchell studied him for a long moment. "Do you have any idea what's coming?" Bull's jaw flexed. "Sir, it was an accident," she stumbled. "Stop." The colonel's tone was sharp, final. "There are 12 witness statements saying otherwise. You assaulted one of your soldiers, on record, during a monitored exercise." Bull's throat worked as he swallowed. "They're exaggerating." Mitchell leaned forward. "You kicked a subordinate in the head, Sergeant. Don't insult both of us by pretending otherwise." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Finally the colonel spoke again, lower now. "You've been relieved of duty, effective immediately. MP escort is waiting outside." Bull opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught. There was no coming back from this. Not this time. 2 military police officers stepped into the office. Bull didn't resist. He walked out quietly, the echo of his boots fatting down the hall, the sound of a career ending. Word spread fast. Soldiers across the base whispered that an arrest had been made. Some felt satisfaction, others fear. Jenny sat alone in the infirmary during her lunch break, scrolling through her phone. The photos Marcus had taken, the blood, the rocks, Sarah's torn uniform, were now evidence. She turned the screen off, couldn't look anymore. When Tom walked in, she didn't turn. "They arrested him," he said quietly. "Good." But her tone wasn't triumphant, just tired. Tom pulled up a chair. "You did everything right that day, Jen." She shook her head. "No, we all froze, we watched it happen." He didn't argue, because she was right. By the time the first official inquiry began, the situation had already outgrown Fort Carson. Unbeknownst to most of the battalion, a senior observer from the Pentagon had been visiting that week, a decorated colonel named Patricia Hayes. Her task had been simple: assess combat readiness. Instead, she'd witnessed a sergeant assaulting a subordinate through her field glasses, and she had reported it directly. The call traveled faster than anyone at the base could imagine, up through the chain, beyond Mitchell's desk, across D.C. offices where the word assault turned heads and tightened jaws. Files opened, names reviewed, careers measured by what they'd done or failed to do. Sarah Martinez had become a case study in everything the Army wanted to believe it had left behind. At Walter Reed, recovery was slow. Every day, Sarah tested her memory, the date, the faces, the voices. Some came back easily, others hid behind fog. The doctors called it post-traumatic amnesia. She called it fragments. There were moments of clarity, too. The sound of rain against the window, the smell of disinfectant, her mother reading aloud from her grandfather's old letters. And then a question that wouldn't leave her alone: what happens now? One afternoon, Jenny arrived, wearing her uniform still dusted from base drills. She looked out of place amid the quiet white hallways. Sarah smiled weakly. "They let you come." Jenny nodded. "Command's a mess. They're interviewing everyone, but I needed to see you." She sat beside her bed, her voice soft. "You scared the hell out of us." Sarah looked away. "I didn't think he'd actually." "I know." For a while they sat in silence, the kind of silence that held too many words. Then Sarah asked, "What's happening back there?" Jenny hesitated. "It's bigger than any of us thought. CID's involved. Pentagon too. They're calling witnesses from every unit Bull ever touched." Sarah frowned. "All that because of me." Jenny's hand tightened on hers. "Because of what he did, and because you survived it." Back on base, Colonel Mitchell's command unraveled by the hour. Investigators moved through offices like storm fronts, collecting files, questioning soldiers. Every ignored complaint, every whispered warning about Bull, all of it resurfaced. Tom spent 2 hours in an interview room, describing every detail he remembered: the crawl, the kick, the blood. When it was over, the investigator, a calm, unreadable man in a plain uniform, nodded and said quietly, "You did the right thing coming forward." Tom wanted to laugh. The right thing had come months too late. By week's end, Fort Carson was holding its breath. Rumors swirled about generals, plural, flying in from Washington, about investigations not just of Bull, but of leadership failure up the chain. Soldiers avoided eye contact in hallways, uncertain who might be next. And still at the center of it all was Sarah. The doctors said her condition was improving, slow but steady. The headaches were bad, the dizziness worse, but the nights were the hardest. Sometimes she'd wake gasping, certain she was still on that mountainside, the wind in her ears, Bull's shadow looming. She'd reach for her rifle that wasn't there, her pulse racing until she remembered. Hospital bed, safe, breathing. But safety didn't feel real anymore. One night a nurse found her sitting upright, staring at the wall. "You need to rest," the nurse said gently. Sarah's eyes were distant. "He hated me because I didn't quit. Isn't that strange?" The nurse didn't answer. Because it wasn't strange. It was human, the kind of human darkness the uniform couldn't wash away. 2 days later, 3 phone calls changed everything. Colonel Patricia Hayes called Major General Robert Thompson, her direct superior, to report the full scope of the incident. Thompson, in turn, called Lieutenant General Patricia Kowalski, the Army's senior female commander and longtime advocate for cultural reform. And Kowalski called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marcus Williams. Within 12 hours, an emergency review board was convened. Reports, recordings, witness statements, all laid bare before the highest military office in the country. Williams read every line himself. By midnight, he made his decision. "Tomorrow morning," he said to his staff, "we're going to Fort Carson." That same night, Sarah woke to the soft hum of the hospital's air vents. Her room was dark except for the small glow of the monitors beside her. Her mother slept in a chair nearby. Sarah stared at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting like the IV fluid in her veins. What would happen to him, to Bull, to everyone who had looked away? And beneath all that noise, one quiet thought surfaced, something she hadn't dared to feel until then. Maybe her grandfather had been right. Courage wasn't a word, it was a choice. And tomorrow, someone else was about to make theirs. The next morning, 3 black SUVs rolled through the gates of Fort Carson, moving with purpose. Soldiers stopped to watch. No one spoke. Inside the lead vehicle, General Marcus Williams adjusted his cap and stared straight ahead. "End it," he said quietly to the driver, "for her and for everyone like her." The convoy didn't slow. It was time for accountability. And by sunset, an entire battalion would cease to exist. Why were 3 generals flying to a single battalion post in Colorado? No one at Fort Carson had the answer. By dawn, rumors were already chasing the wind. Someone said it was an inspection. Someone else whispered about a scandal reaching Washington. But deep down, every soldier knew the truth, something irreversible had happened, and the highest ranks of the United States Army were coming to finish it. The sky that morning was a pale, merciless blue. Frost clung to the grass outside headquarters as the sound of engines echoed across the parade ground. 3 black SUVs rolled through the gate with military precision. Every movement, every step, carried authority heavy enough to bend the air. From the first vehicle stepped General Marcus Williams, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His presence alone was an earthquake in the chain of command, the kind of visit that meant someone's career, or perhaps an entire command, was already ashes. Behind him came Lieutenant General Patricia Kowalski, the first woman to ever lead the Army's infantry branch. Silver hair pinned tight, eyes sharp as razors. And in the third vehicle, Major General Robert Thompson, a man whose reputation for zero tolerance toward abuse was legend among officers. They didn't come for ceremony, they came for reckoning. Inside his office, Colonel Mitchell stood frozen. The call had come only 5 minutes earlier. "General Williams is inbound. Prepare to receive him." He'd barely buttoned his dress coat when the knock came. The door opened, and suddenly 3 of the most powerful figures in the U.S. military were in his small, wood-paneled office. The air seemed to thin out. "Colonel," Williams began, voice steady but cold, "we're here because of the assault on Private Sarah Martinez and the command failures that allowed it." No preamble, no small talk, just the truth dropped like a shell onto his desk. Mitchell tried to find words. "Sir, the investigation." "We've read the investigation," Kowalski interrupted, her tone cutting through him like a blade. "We've also read every ignored complaint, every red flag report you buried under pending review." Her eyes didn't blink. "You failed her." Mitchell's mouth went dry. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that resources were thin, that protocol slowed things down, but excuses sounded small in the presence of people who'd commanded wars. Williams stepped closer. "When leadership forgets that soldiers are human, discipline becomes cruelty, and cruelty spreads. You didn't just lose control of one man, Colonel. You lost your unit's soul." The words hit harder than any punishment order. Behind him, Thompson placed a folder on the desk. Inside were photos, Sarah's blood on the rocks, the statements of her squad mates, and Bull's disciplinary record stretching back years. "This," Thompson said quietly, "isn't a single failure, it's rot." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, Williams turned toward the door. "Gather your officers, parade ground, 10 minutes." Mitchell swallowed hard. "Sir, may I ask what's the nature of—" "You'll hear it with them." Outside, soldiers lined up in stunned silence. No one dared whisper now. The entire battalion stood at attention under a brittle Colorado sun, the wind carrying the faint hiss of flags overhead. Tom, Marcus, and Jenny were among them, faces tight, hearts pounding. They'd been told only that senior leadership was visiting. None expected this. When the generals appeared, time seemed to slow. Williams walked front and center, the others flanking him like judgment made flesh. He stopped before the assembled formation. "I know you've all heard rumors," he began, voice carrying with ease across the open ground. "You've heard that something happened to one of your own. I'm here to tell you the rumors are true and worse than you think." A ripple moved through the formation. No words, just breath. "A soldier in this battalion was assaulted by her superior during training. That soldier's name is Private Sarah Martinez. She is alive." Jenny closed her eyes in silent relief. Williams continued. "What happened here is not just the act of one man. It is the result of leadership failure at every level, from NCO to command. The Army cannot allow such failure to exist within its ranks." He paused, letting the words sink into the cold air. "When a unit becomes toxic, when fear replaces trust, when harassment replaces discipline, it forfeits the right to exist." Every head snapped upward. "Forfeits the right to exist." Williams turned to Kowalski, who stepped forward. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, but no less devastating. "Effective immediately, the 2nd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment is disbanded. Its colors will be retired, its personnel reassigned. This unit, as it stands, will cease to exist before sunset." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A murmur ran through the formation, then died instantly as MPs moved among them, collecting rifles, issuing instructions. Thompson's voice followed, low and firm. "Command responsibility does not end with one man's crime. Every leader who saw and stayed silent will answer for it." Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, face pale. "Sir, with respect, this will destroy careers." "It already has," Williams said simply. From a distance, the dismantling of a battalion looks orderly, lists, files, trucks. But up close, it's chaos wearing a uniform. By midday, company clerks were boxing records. Armory officers logged weapons transfers. Platoons stood waiting for reassignment orders, their patches still warm on their sleeves. Tom's squad was one of the last to be processed. The three of them, Tom, Jenny, Marcus, stood together, saying little. Marcus broke the silence. "You think she knows?" "Sarah," Jenny asked. "Yeah, all of this is for her." Jenny's throat tightened. "She will." Across the field, Colonel Mitchell removed the battalion colors from their stand. The fabric fluttered once in the wind before folding into his hands. A photographer snapped a single image, history recording the moment. An entire command was erased. Kowalski watched without expression. She'd seen units born and units die, but never like this, not for dishonor, not for moral failure. And yet, somewhere deep beneath her discipline, she felt a spark of pride. Accountability had finally arrived, wearing the stars it had always deserved. That evening, in a quiet room at Walter Reed, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps. When she turned her head, she saw a tall woman in full dress uniform standing beside her bed. 3 stars glinted on her shoulders. "Private Martinez," the woman said softly. "I'm Lieutenant General Patricia Kowalski." Sarah blinked, confused. "Ma'am." The general's expression gentled. "I came to tell you what happened today." She pulled a chair closer and sat. "The men and women who failed you have been removed. Sergeant Harrison will face court-martial. Your colonel is relieved. The battalion you served in has been disbanded." Sarah stared at her, trying to process the words. "Disbanded." Yes, because of me. Kowalski shook her head slowly. Because of us. Because of what we allowed to grow. You were the one who endured it long enough for the truth to be seen. That takes a kind of courage the uniform can't teach. For a moment, neither spoke. Machines hummed softly between them. Then Sarah whispered, I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to serve. I know, the general said. That's why it matters. She stood, adjusting her coat. You rest now, Private. You've started something we won't let end. When she left, Sarah lay still, staring at the ceiling. Her pulse monitor ticked steady and slow. Outside, beyond the hospital walls, news outlets were already breaking the story. Army disbands entire battalion after assault investigation. Headlines rolled across screens, and for once the comments weren't cruel. Veterans called it justice. Civilians called it overdue. But Sarah didn't read any of it. She just closed her eyes and let the sound of the monitors steady her breathing. Back at Fort Carson, night fell over a base that felt hollow. The one-scrouted barracks were dark, windows empty. Trucks lined up under floodlights, carrying crates of weapons, gear, and memories toward other units. The 215 no longer existed, not on paper, not in voice. Tom watched from a distance, arms folded. For the first time in his career, he felt both shame and relief in equal measure. Marcus stood beside him. You think it'll make a difference? Tom exhaled. It has to. Jenny joined them, her voice soft. If it doesn't, then what was all of this for? They stood in silence, three figures against the floodlit emptiness. Somewhere in that emptiness, a moral weight settled, a reminder that silence can be its own kind of crime. 2 days later, Bull sat alone in a holding cell, the hum of fluorescent lights above him. His uniform had been stripped of rank. No name, no insignia, just fabric and failure. A folder lay on the metal table, charges, witness statements, the official record of everything he destroyed. He stared at the wall. In the stillness, a single truth began to take shape, something he'd spent years denying. He hated her because she'd never feared him, and when she refused to break, he did instead. The guards opened the door, time to move. He didn't resist. Outside, cameras flashed as they led him to transport. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. The world had already judged him. At Walter Reed, Sarah took her first steps without assistance, slow, trembling, but hers. Each footfall echoed like the start of a new language her body had to relearn. Her mother cried quietly in the doorway. Her father just stood there, arms crossed, pride and pain warring behind his eyes. Sarah looked up at them and managed a faint smile. See, told you I'm stubborn. He laughed through the tears. That's the Martinez blood. The nurse steadied her, but Sarah waved her off. I've got it. And she did. For the first time since that mountainside, she felt the weight of her own strength again, fragile but real. Far away, in the Pentagon briefing room, General Williams ended a press conference with words that would echo through every training base in the country. Strength, he said, is not cruelty. Authority is not power. The Army exists to protect its soldiers, not to destroy them from within. He paused, eyes scanning the cameras. Private Sarah Martinez reminded us of that truth. We owe her more than justice. We owe her change. The reporters fell silent. Even through the static of the televised feed, the message carried. That night, as snow began to fall over D.C., Sarah sat by the hospital window, watching flakes blur the world into quiet gray. She thought about the mountains, the crawl, the silence that had followed the kick. She thought about the battalion that no longer existed, about Jenny, Marcus, and Tom, about the generals who had come because she refused to give up. The pain still pulsed behind her eyes, dull but constant, a reminder of what survival costs. And yet beneath it something warm stirred, not pride, not victory, something smaller. Peace maybe. Or the beginning of it. She whispered to the glass, fogging it with her breath, "You didn't break me." Outside, the city lights flickered against the snow. And somewhere deep within the machinery of the army, policies were already changing, rules being rewritten, futures quietly rearranged, all because one soldier had chosen not to stay silent. The battalion was gone, the scars remained, but the story wasn't over. Because healing, like courage, is never a single moment. It's a series of choices, one after another, to keep standing when the world has already fallen. And Sarah Martinez was just beginning to stand again. Why was the applause so quiet? The hospital hallway was full of doctors, nurses, even visiting soldiers. But when Sarah took her first unassisted steps from her ward to the courtyard, no one dared to cheer too loudly. The sound of clapping seemed out of place in a place meant for healing, for reverence. Still she heard it, a soft rhythm of hands and hearts that said what words couldn't, "You made it this far." Her gait was slow, uneven, but steady. The sunlight hit her face for the first time in weeks. The cold air bit gently at her skin, reminding her she was still here, still alive. She sat on a bench near the fountain, the sound of running water mingling with the distant thrum of helicopters from the flight line. The world hadn't stopped turning, even when hers had. She touched the scar above her left temple, feeling the rough edge beneath her fingertips. It still hurt sometimes, but the pain had become familiar, like a shadow that followed her everywhere. Jenny had told her that the unit was gone, disbanded, reassigned. Sarah hadn't believed it at first. The army didn't just erase entire battalions, not unless something was rotten to the core. She closed her eyes, listening to the fountain's rhythm. Somewhere deep down, part of her wanted to feel satisfied, vindicated maybe, but all she could feel was tired. Justice had a strange sound. It wasn't loud or triumphant, it was quiet, lonely. The doctors said her recovery was a miracle. The impact should have fractured her skull beyond repair. Instead, she'd come away with concussions, nerve damage, and a memory that still glitched at random moments, a face forgotten, a word slipping away mid-sentence. "Your mind's rebuilding itself," one of them said, smiling kindly. "Think of it as rewiring." But Sarah didn't want rewiring. She wanted remembering. Because some nights, the memories returned not as facts, but as flashes. The crunch of gravel, Bull's voice, the world going dark. When she woke, she'd lie still, letting the silence settle until her pulse stopped racing. Sometimes her mother would find her awake and just sit beside her without speaking. Her father, stoic as always, spent more time packing the hospital halls than resting. "You don't have to go back," he told her one evening, his voice low. "You've done enough for that uniform." Sarah looked at him for a long time. But what if leaving means he wins? He sighed. "You don't have to prove anything anymore, kiddo." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not for me, but maybe for someone else who's still out there." The army didn't forget Sarah Martinez. Within weeks, her name became the center of a storm, internal reviews, leadership conferences, and media headlines that refused to fade. Private assault sparks reform. Army disbands battalion in historic move. At first, she hated it. The attention felt invasive, wrong. Every photo, every mention of her name dragged her back to the mountainside she wanted to forget. But then came the letters. They arrived by the hundreds. Some were from female soldiers, privates, sergeants, officers, thanking her for standing through what they couldn't. Some came from men who said they'd served with leaders like Bull, and that her endurance had forced them to see silence for what it really was: compliance. She read every one. Some she cried through, some she couldn't finish. But each one built a truth she hadn't dared believe. Her pain had weight, and that weight had moved something larger than her. When General Kowalski returned 2 weeks later, Sarah met her with clearer eyes. The general smiled faintly when she entered the room. "You look stronger." Sarah nodded. "I feel different." Different is good. They talked quietly for a while about her therapy progress, the ongoing trials, and the restructuring of the training divisions. But then the general's tone shifted, softer. "There's something else," she said. "The Pentagon is forming a new office, the Military Culture and Climate Initiative. We're rethinking how we train leaders, how we detect toxicity before it spreads. I want you on the team." Sarah blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you've seen the worst of it. You understand the human cost in a way data can't describe." Sarah hesitated. "I'm not ready for a desk job." "It's not a desk job," the general said. "It's a fight, just a different kind. We need soldiers who remember why they joined in the first place." Sarah looked down at her hands, the faint tremor still there. "And if I can't be what I was before?" Kowalski smiled softly. "Then be something new." For days after that meeting, Sarah wrestled with the decision. Every step of recovery felt like a negotiation between who she'd been and who she might become. She missed the rhythm of training, the crisp sound of commands, the smell of the range. But the thought of returning to combat made her chest tighten. Her therapist, Captain Reynolds, said it was normal. "You were conditioned to survive, not to heal," he said one morning during session. "Soldiers are taught to endure pain, not to make sense of it afterward." Sarah stared out the window. "I used to think pain was proof I was doing something right. And now," she exhaled, "now I'm not sure what right even means." Reynolds smiled gently. "That uncertainty is where courage starts." Meanwhile, the world kept turning, but the military world didn't forget. Across the country, at bases and academies, leadership seminars began using the Martinez case as a new kind of case study. PowerPoint slides, discussion prompts, videos. Accountability in command environments. Ethical leadership in high-stress units. Sarah's name became shorthand for what happened when silence becomes policy. Tom, reassigned to a leadership training division in Fort Benning, stood before a classroom of young lieutenants one morning. The slide behind him showed a simple line of text: "Discipline without humanity is tyranny." He didn't mention Sarah by name. He didn't have to. Marcus, now promoted to sergeant, helped design new field drills for identifying harassment patterns during exercises. Every time he saw a new recruit hesitate to speak up, he remembered the way Sarah had looked, head held high, silent, unbroken, and he made sure those soldiers knew their voices mattered. And Jenny, bright, resilient Jenny, was back in medical school, training to specialize in trauma recovery for military personnel. On her dorm desk, a photo of the old squad sat framed beside her textbooks, 4 faces in desert camo, arms around each other, smiling. The smile meant something different now. It wasn't pride. It was survival. Months passed. The scars on Sarah's head faded to a thin, pale line. The headaches came less often. The nightmares, though, they lingered. Sometimes she dreamed she was back on the mountain, but the figures around her were faceless, blurred. In the dream, Bull never kicked her. He just stood there, waiting, silent. And that silence terrified her more than the violence ever had. Her doctor said it was her mind reclaiming power, replaying what she'd lived through to rewrite the ending. In the dreams, sometimes she stood up and walked away. Sometimes she turned to him and said nothing at all, and that silence felt like victory. 6 months after the assault, a letter arrived at her hospital room. The envelope bore the Pentagon seal. Inside, one page: "You are hereby invited to serve as Special Advisor for Cultural Integrity under the Office of Military Climate and Leadership. Your insights will directly support reforms within the Department of Defense. Report date March 3rd. LT, Jen Patricia Kowalski." Sarah read it twice. Her mother watched quietly. "That's important." Sarah nodded. "It feels heavy." Her father crossed his arms, the faintest smile breaking through. "Heavy's good. Means it matters." She folded the letter carefully. Then I guess I'm not done yet. Her first day back in uniform was harder than any training course she'd ever faced. The mirror reflected someone she didn't recognize, same eyes, same shoulders, but something older behind them. Not broken, just tempered. The moment she stepped onto the Pentagon grounds, the world felt different. The air smelled of paper and marble, not dust and oil. There were no rifles here, just decisions that could change thousands of lives. Walking the long corridor toward her new office, she passed walls lined with portraits of men and women who'd shaped military history. She wondered if any of them had ever imagined that change might begin with something as small as a refusal to bow. When she entered the room, Kowalski was waiting. "Welcome home, Private Martinez," she said warmly. "Or should I say, Advisor Martinez?" Sarah smiled, still getting used to that. "Good," the general said. "It means you're grounded." They sat. For the next hour, Kowalski outlined the mission: new training systems, ethical accountability programs, anonymous reporting networks. Every sentence was a step toward something Sarah had once thought impossible: prevention. When the meeting ended, the general stood and said quietly, "You didn't just survive, Sarah. You changed us." For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak. Then she whispered, "I didn't do it alone." That night, sitting alone in her small Pentagon apartment, Sarah opened her old journal. The pages were wrinkled and stained, words written back when she still thought silence was safety. She read one line out loud, softly. "He wants me gone, but I can't leave. If I quit, the next one doesn't stand a chance." She smiled sadly, closing the book. Outside, the Washington skyline glowed faintly under a gray sky. Somewhere below, a lone soldier walked across the courtyard, her boots echoing softly in the night. Sarah watched her for a moment, that steady stride, that quiet purpose, and felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not the loud, fiery kind that burns too fast. The kind that hums like a heartbeat, quiet, patient, unbreakable. Some wounds never close. Some scars never fade. But maybe they're not supposed to. Maybe they're reminders not of what broke us, but of what we rebuilt afterward. Sarah Martinez had entered the army to serve her country. She stayed to save it from itself. And though the road ahead would be long, she was ready to walk it, one steady, deliberate step at a time. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence feel heavier in rooms full of power? Sarah Martinez had been in war rooms before, briefing halls where maps glowed red and blue under fluorescent light, where the hum of projectors mixed with the rustle of uniforms. But the Pentagon was different. The silence here wasn't fear. It was calculation. Every word carried weight. Every pause meant something. Her new office sat at the end of a polished corridor lined with photos of decorated generals and medals in glass. She passed them daily, wondering how many of those smiling faces had ever seen the kind of rot she'd lived through, or if they'd just looked away. When she first arrived, no one greeted her with hostility. The resistance was quieter than that: polite smiles, subtle deflections, the way some officers' eyes slid past her as if she were a temporary inconvenience rather than a symbol of reform. She'd been warned it would happen. Change, General Kowalski had said, rarely gets applause. It gets quiet rooms and polite denials. Sarah had smiled then. She wasn't afraid of quiet. She learned to survive it long ago. But surviving and belonging were two different things. Her first week was an avalanche of briefings. Reports on harassment prevention, leadership accountability programs, unit climate surveys. Most of it was numbers, graphs, percentages, sanitized data. To Sarah, they all felt empty. "These are symptoms," she told the team during her first presentation, standing before a room of colonels and analysts. "They don't tell you what soldiers actually feel." One officer, older, gray-haired, starched uniform, leaned back with an easy smirk. "With respect, Advisor Martinez, feelings don't build readiness. Discipline does. Sarah met his eyes. Discipline without empathy isn't readiness, it's just control. The room fell silent. A few faces softened, others stiffened. After the meeting, a younger captain caught up with her in the hallway. "You just said what half this building been too scared to," he said quietly. "They'll remember that." "I'm not here to make friends," she replied. "Good," he said, "because you won't." That night in her small Pentagon apartment, Sarah reread a memo draft on her tablet, proposed ethical climate reforms for field units. The words looked too clean, too distant from the world she remembered. She closed the file and opened her old journal instead. The last page she'd written was from her hospital bed. "If they forget what happened, it'll happen again." She set the book down, staring at the ceiling. Some nights she still heard the echo of gravel under boots, the thud that ended everything. She pressed her palms against her eyes and whispered, "You're not there anymore." But memory doesn't follow orders. A week later, Sarah stood outside a conference room waiting for a high-level meeting on leadership reform. Inside were officers who'd spent decades defining what strength meant in the Army. She'd been invited as a consultant, but she knew what that really meant: the token survivor, the human face of policy. She straightened her uniform anyway and stepped in. General Williams was there, seated beside Kowalski and Thompson. The moment she entered, all three generals nodded in acknowledgement, quiet solidarity among those who had stood at the same crossroads of failure and reform. Williams opened the meeting. "We're not here to polish image. We're here to prevent another Fort Carson." He glanced at Sarah. "Advisor Martinez, you've lived what we're trying to fix. You have the floor." Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to rooms like this, rows of brass stars and ribbons, the kind of men and women whose decisions shaped history. She took a slow breath. "You can't legislate morality," she began. "You can't train empathy the same way you train marksmanship, but you can build systems that make silence harder and courage easier." She clicked her remote. Photos flashed on the screen, smiling soldiers training camps the Colorado mountains. Then came one photo the room wasn't expecting, a close-up of a soldier's hands, scraped raw, bleeding from gravel. "This," she said quietly, "is what silence costs." No one moved. She let the slide fade to black. "I'm not asking for pity," she continued. "I'm asking for leadership, because leadership isn't shouting orders. It's standing between the strong and the weak and saying, 'Not here, not under my command.'" Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she didn't flinch. For a moment, even the generals didn't speak. Then General Thompson leaned forward. "That's going into the new doctrine manual." The room exhaled. The moment passed, but the message didn't. Over the following months, Sarah became both respected and resented. Her reports began circulating across commands. Training programs shifted. Commanders were now required to attend culture integrity seminars before deployments, a direct result of her recommendations. But with progress came backlash. An anonymous message appeared in her inbox one morning. "You're making the Army soft. People get hurt in training. It's part of the job. Stay in your lane." She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she deleted it. Another came 2 days later. "You're only here because of what happened, not because you earned it." She didn't delete that one. She printed it, folded it, and slipped it into the back of her journal as a reminder of what she was fighting. Every reform she pushed for came with friction. Meetings turned into debates. Proposals were dissected, delayed, diluted. She learned quickly that change didn't happen through emotion alone. It took precision, the same discipline she'd learned on the range, the same endurance that had kept her crawling across those rocks. So she fought quietly, methodically. One policy, one meeting, one word changed in a manual that could shift an entire culture over time. Sometimes, late at night, She'd walk the empty Pentagon corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against marble. She'd pass young officers still working, coffee cups beside piles of reports, and she'd think, they don't even know this place used to pretend people like me didn't exist. The thought didn't make her angry anymore. It made her resolute. Outside those walls, her story had already spread far beyond the military. Documentaries, college lectures, advocacy panels. When a journalist reached out for an exclusive interview, Sarah refused. "This isn't a story about me," she said. "It's about the system that broke and the people who fixed it." But the journalist persisted, asking if she could at least record one quote. Sarah thought for a moment, then said, "Strength isn't measured by who you can command. It's measured by who you choose to protect." The quote went viral within hours. She didn't read the comments. She didn't need to. Despite the progress, the nightmares persisted. In one, she was back on the mountainside, except this time she wasn't the one crawling. It was someone else, faceless, smaller. A recruit, maybe. And Bull's voice echoed somewhere behind her, unchanged, unbroken. She'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, reaching for her dog tags like a talisman. Therapy helped, but some wounds don't close, they just stop bleeding. Her therapist once told her, "You're living two wars, the one that happened, and the one that didn't stop." He was right. But every morning she woke up and put on the uniform again, she reminded herself. This was how the war was won, not with bullets, but with endurance. One rainy afternoon, Sarah visited Fort Carson for the first time since the incident. The base looked different, new units, new insignias, new leaders. The old 215 barracks stood empty, slated for renovation. She walked through the courtyard where Bull had once barked orders, the same space where she'd done those push-ups under his watchful eyes. The rain slicked the concrete, erasing footprints as quickly as they appeared. She stopped near the training field. The mountain fog hung low, soft and gray. A young soldier passed by and did a double-take. "Ma'am, are you Advisor Martinez?" Sarah smiled faintly, just Sarah. He hesitated. "They told us about what happened here, in ethics class." "Yeah." He nodded. "They said it's why we do things differently now, why we speak up." Sarah looked out across the field, where the mist curled like breath. Then it was worth it. The young soldier straightened. "Ma'am, thank you for..." She stopped him gently. "Don't thank me, just keep the promise." He nodded and jogged off toward the motor pool. Sarah stood alone for a moment longer, the rain soaking through her jacket, and whispered to the empty air, "You see this, Grandpa? You'd be proud." Back in Washington, progress continued. General Williams retired that year, leaving a legacy speech that included her name. Kowalski took command of a new division focused on ethics and leadership training. And Sarah, against her own expectations, became the face of the movement. She hated the spotlight, but accepted the responsibility. During a televised address to cadets at West Point, she spoke with quiet conviction. Strength isn't the sound of command. It's the silence that follows when you've done what's right, because real authority doesn't need to shout, it simply stands. The audience didn't cheer right away. They just stood slowly in a ripple of quiet respect. For Sarah, that silence was everything. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pity, it was understanding. Later that night, she returned to her quarters and opened her window. The hum of the city was distant, steady, like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. She looked up at the stars and thought of all the people who had carried her when she couldn't carry herself. Jenny, Marcus, Tom, her parents, her generals. And she thought of Bull, too, not with anger anymore, but with clarity. He wanted to break her because he believed strength was measured in domination. He was wrong. Strength had never been about control. It was about restraint, about dignity, about standing up and then helping someone else stand too. She whispered into the quiet night, "You lost, Bull, and you didn't even know what game you were playing." Then she smiled faintly, not out of triumph but peace. Because the game was never about winning. It was about changing the rules. The army moved forward. So did she. But deep inside, Sarah knew reform was never permanent. It had to be guarded, watched over by those who remembered. And she would remember. Always. Because memory, like courage, wasn't a burden. It was a duty. And that duty had become her life's work. Why did applause always sound lonelier from behind a microphone? Sarah stood under the blinding stage lights, the seal of the Department of Defense projected behind her. Rows of journalists, officers, and cadets filled the auditorium. Her speech was already done. The cameras were still rolling, but all she wanted was to disappear backstage, away from the spotlight that had turned her life into a headline. When the applause finally faded, she stepped off the platform and exhaled. The air felt too thin, her chest too tight. A young intern rushed forward. "Ma'am, the secretary wants a photo with you." "Of course," Sarah said, forcing a smile. Her cheeks ached from it. The photo would appear on the front page by morning. From survivor to leader, Martinez, and the movement that changed the army. But no one would see the exhaustion behind her eyes. No one ever did. By the time she got home that night, her phone had 47 unread messages. Media requests, invitations to panels, congratulatory notes from commanders she'd never met. She ignored them all. The apartment was quiet. She tossed her keys onto the counter, kicked off her boots, and sank into the couch. For a long time she just sat there, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the dark TV screen, uniform still crisp, eyes hollow. She reached for her journal, flipping to the back. The folded anonymous note she'd kept for months slid out. "You're only here because of what happened." She unfolded it, looked at the words again, then refolded it carefully. For the first time she wasn't angry. She just whispered, "Maybe that's true." Because lately, she'd begun to wonder, was she changing the system? Or was the system just using her story to look changed? The next morning, the city was gray with winter rain. At the Pentagon, Sarah walked the hallways slower than usual. Every few steps, someone stopped to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how her courage had inspired a generation. Each thank you felt heavier, not lighter. Her new project was supposed to overhaul officer training across all branches. But the meetings had started to drag, politics creeping in, budgets trimmed, priorities realigned. The momentum that once carried her work like a wave was beginning to slow. She noticed it in the way some senior officers spoke, measured, noncommittal. Reform fatigue, they called it privately. "We've done enough for now." Enough. The word echoed in her head like an accusation. That evening, she met with General Kowalski in her office. The older woman's face was drawn, tired but steady. "You're pushing too hard," she said gently. "Even reformers need to breathe." Sarah frowned. "If I slow down, they'll bury this under paperwork." "Maybe, but if you burn out, who carries it forward?" Sarah looked away. "People shouldn't need me to remind them why this matters." Kowalski sighed. "They shouldn't, but they do. That's the burden of being the first. You have to hold the door open long enough for others to walk through." The silence stretched between them. Finally, the general said softly, "Go home, Sarah, rest." "I'll rest when it sticks," Sarah murmured. Kowalski smiled faintly. "That's what I said 20 years ago. Didn't end well." 2 weeks later, the backlash hit. A leaked report surfaced online, an internal review suggesting the new ethical programs had reduced training efficiency and compromised combat readiness. Headlines spun fast. Did Martinez reforms go too far? Talk shows debated whether the army was being softened. Within hours, Sarah's inbox flooded with messages again, some supportive, many not. "You're killing tradition. You've turned soldiers into victims. What did you think would happen when you made feelings policy?" She turned off her phone and sat in silence, staring out her window as the sun disappeared behind the Capitol dome. For the first time in a long while, she felt small again. By morning, she was summoned to a closed-door meeting with senior leadership. The room was crowded: generals, policy advisors, Pentagon staffers. General Thompson chaired the session. He got straight to the point. The report's stirring noise on the Hill. Congress wants answers. Sarah sat straighter. With respect, sir, the data's misleading. Units that adopted the reforms show higher retention and morale rates. Another officer, older, leaned forward. And slower operational readiness. These are warfighters, Advisor Martinez, not social experiments. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. We're not weakening them. We're protecting them from each other. The man scoffed. You can't fight wars with safe spaces. The room tensed. Kowalski, seated nearby, fixed him with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. You can't fight wars with broken soldiers either. Silence. Thompson cleared his throat. Enough. The reforms stand pending full review. Advisor Martinez will need you to appear before the Armed Services Committee next week. Sarah nodded, though her stomach turned. Public hearings were brutal. She'd seen what they did to people, twist their lives into sound bites. Still, she said, understood. The night before the hearing, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, papers spread before her, reports, statistics, testimonials. But none of it felt real anymore. She thought about her team, the young officers who'd believed in her mission. She thought about the letters from soldiers who'd written, "Because of you, I didn't quit." And she thought about that night in Colorado, the cold air, the dirt in her teeth, the kick that could have ended her story before it began. She ran her fingers along the edge of the scar, near her hairline. "This is what they don't see," she whispered. "This is the cost." Her reflection in the window looked back at her, older, harder, but still standing. She closed her eyes and breathed. You've survived worse. The hearing was broadcast live. Rows of cameras. Politicians lined up behind polished wood desks. When her name was called, Sarah stood, walked to the microphone, and raised her right hand for the oath. Her voice didn't shake. The chairman began. Advisor Martinez, your reforms have been praised and criticized. Some say they save lives. Others say they soften discipline. Why should the military keep them? Sarah met his gaze. Because strength without humanity isn't strength, it's fear. And fear doesn't build armies, it breaks them. The chairman leaned back. And what do you say to those who think you've politicized the uniform? She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she said quietly, I say the uniform means nothing if we stop earning the right to wear it. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. A congresswoman at the end of the table leaned forward. Private Martinez, are you still proud to serve? Sarah smiled faintly. Yes, ma'am, maybe more now than ever, because service doesn't mean silence. The hearing ended with a standing ovation, not from the politicians, but from the soldiers seated in the back rows. The next morning's headlines were different this time. Martinez stands firm, service doesn't mean silence. But victory always comes at a cost. A week later, Sarah collapsed during a morning briefing. Overwork, dehydration, exhaustion. The doctors called it cumulative stress response. Kowalski sat beside her hospital bed that night. I told you to breathe, she said softly. Sarah managed a faint smile. Guess I forgot. You've carried this too long, the general said. You don't have to save the army alone. Sarah looked at her hands. If I stop now, it all unravels. No, Kowalski said. If you stop now, someone else starts. Sarah's eyes met hers. You think someone will? I don't think, the general said. I know because you taught them how. Recovery took weeks. For once, Sarah didn't fight it. She read books, took long walks, learned to sit in silence again without flinching. One afternoon, she received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, a young female cadet in training gear, smiling at the camera. On the back, just one line written in neat, steady handwriting. "I joined because of you." Sarah stared at it for a long time. Then she laughed softly, tears slipping down her face. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the mission." When she finally returned to work, she moved slower, not because she was weaker, but because she'd learned that change doesn't sprint. It marches, one step at a time. The media still called her the reformer. Her team still called her ma'am. But inside, she was just Sarah again, a soldier who'd survived, endured, and rebuilt. That evening, she stood outside the Pentagon, watching the sunset burn the sky gold and crimson. She thought about the girl who'd once crawled across gravel, desperate just to live another second. If that girl could see her now standing here, unbroken, maybe she'd understand what all the pain was for. Because survival was never the end of her story. It was the beginning of everyone else. The wind picked up, tugging gently at her hair. Sarah closed her eyes, whispered to the fading light, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak." She smiled. "It simply acts." And then she walked back inside, ready for whatever came next. Why did the offer feel heavier than the medal they'd pinned on her chest? The letter lay on her desk, official seal, bold type. Reinstatement to active field status, Special Operations Liaison, Afghanistan region. Sarah stared at it for nearly an hour before touching it. The Army wanted her back in uniform, not as a symbol, not as an advisor, but as a soldier again. Boots in the dirt, weapon in hand, mission orders, not policy drafts. She had spent years fighting the invisible wars inside offices and hearing rooms. But this was different. This was the battlefield calling her name again, the place where everything had started and nearly ended. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Was she ready to wear the weight again? Or was she afraid of remembering who she used to be? When she told General Kowalski, the older woman didn't look surprised. "They've been watching you," the general said. "They see a survivor who rebuilt an institution. They think that kind of grit can fix broken morale overseas." Sarah frowned. "I'm not sure I belong there anymore." "You don't have to belong," Kowalski said. "You just have to be willing." "Willing to what? Relive it." The general's expression softened, maybe to redefine it. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside the window, the city buzzed with quiet energy, civilians on sidewalks, soldiers in motion. "Every war leaves two fronts," Kowalski finally said. "One out there and one in here." She tapped her chest. "Maybe it's time you see if the battlefield still belongs to you." Sarah didn't answer. Because part of her wanted to say yes. The soldier in her, the part that still smelled dust and adrenaline in her sleep, wanted to return, to prove that the uniform still fit. But the survivor in her hesitated. She fought so long to escape that world. Could she step back into it without losing the peace she'd fought to find? That night Sarah drove out of D.C., past the noise and light, until the city gave way to open fields. She stopped at a small rest area and stepped out. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars sharp against black. The air smelled like rain and earth, not concrete. For the first time in months, she took a full breath. She closed her eyes and whispered to the dark, "What am I chasing, closure or purpose?" But the night offered no answer. A week later, she found herself at a training field in Quantico, watching a group of young recruits run drills. Their movements were rough, unpolished, but eager, hungry to prove something. As she stood there, a drill sergeant noticed her and jogged over. "Advisor Martinez, right? We heard you were coming by." "Just observing," she said. The sergeant nodded. "These kids grew up reading about you. Half of them signed up because of your case." Sarah's stomach tightened. "That's humbling." He laughed softly. It's pressure, too. They think you're a legend. Then I hope they never meet me, she said quietly. The sergeant frowned. Why that? Because legends don't wake up from nightmares. She walked away before he could reply. Later that evening, she stayed behind as the sun dipped low over the range. The recruits had gone, leaving only echoing wind and scattered shell casings glittering in the dirt. She picked one up, rolling it between her fingers, brass, cold, weightless. Once this had been her language, the rhythm of fire and reload, the control of breath, of stillness, of fear turned into precision. She set the casing down and whispered, "Do I still belong to this?" Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text, Jenny. Jenny, heard about the offer, you okay? Sarah, still deciding. Jenny, then remember, healing doesn't mean hiding. Sarah smiled faintly at that. Leave it to Jenny to find the truth in one line. The next morning, Sarah visited her parents. Their house still smelled like coffee and cedar, warm, steady, unchanged. Her mother listened quietly as Sarah explained the offer. When she finished, her mother asked only one question. Do you want to go? Sarah hesitated. I don't know. Her father, seated by the window, said softly, sometimes not knowing means you're asking the right question. Sarah smiled faintly. You always talk in riddles. He shrugged. Maybe, but if you're afraid, it means it still matters to you. If it didn't, you'd already have your answer. Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. Just promise us one thing, whatever choice you make, don't make it for anyone else. You've spent enough years doing that. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with the reinstatement letter. She read it again, the assignment details, the objectives, the promise of field advisory capacity. No direct combat, but close enough. She placed it beside her old dog tags, the ones she hadn't worn since Colorado. The metal was cool against her palm. She whispered, you almost killed me once, but you also saved me. Because without the army, without that pain, she would have never found her purpose. And without that purpose, she wouldn't be standing here at all. She signed the acceptance line. Returning to active status was like walking into a memory she'd left half-finished. The airfield smelled of jet fuel and sweat. Helicopter rotors beat the morning air like heartbeats. Soldiers moved with the same rhythm she remembered, focused, unspoken unity. But this time they saluted her. Not because of rank, but because of what her name had come to mean. She wasn't here to lead missions. She was here to observe, advise, and ensure that what happened in Colorado would never happen again. Still, every sound, every shout, every barked command brought back echoes of her past. One afternoon, during a training oversight, she froze mid-step when a drill sergeant raised his voice, too sharp, too close to what she remembered. The world tilted for a moment. She felt the gravel again, the pressure, the breath leaving her lungs. Then a voice. Ma'am. A young recruit was standing beside her, concern in his eyes. You okay? She blinked, the world came back. The sunlight, the field, the noise. Sarah nodded. Yeah, just remembering. He hesitated. You don't look like someone who forgets. She smiled faintly. That's the problem. That evening, she walked alone by the perimeter fence as the sky turned gold. The wind carried the faint hum of generators and distant laughter from the mess hall. For the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of being here anymore. The base wasn't her enemy. Her memories weren't either. They were teachers. And maybe, just maybe, she was here to teach too. Over the following months, Sarah became a quiet constant in the region, part mentor, part conscience. She observed how platoons trained, how commanders spoke, how the smallest acts of respect changed entire units. One afternoon, she stopped by the firing range, watching a young woman struggle with her rifle stance. Sarah approached, gently correcting her posture. Relax your shoulders, breathe between the beats of your heart. The recruit glanced at her, nervous. You used to be a sniper, right? Sarah smiled faintly. Used to be, still am sometimes, just with words now. The recruit grinned. You're Martinez. You're the reason we have these new training codes. Sarah nodded almost shyly. Yeah, guess I am. The young woman looked at her for a long time. Then thank you, for all of us. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Don't thank me, just carry it forward. One night, months into her deployment, Sarah received a message from Washington. Reform Division expanding. We want you to lead it full-time when you return. Her chest tightened. This was it, the moment she'd always known would come. Stay here where the air was raw and real, where change felt visible. Or go back to D.C., where she could change policies but never touch the ground they affected. Duty versus healing. Action versus influence. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked out to the edge of camp. The night sky above the desert stretched endless and quiet. She thought of the recruits who smiled now without fear, the officers who treated soldiers like people, not parts. And she thought of her younger self, the one crawling across that mountainside, whispering through blood and pain, "Don't stop." Sarah looked up at the stars and whispered back, "I won't." When dawn came, she wrote her reply. Yes, I'll lead, but not from behind a desk. I'll lead from both fronts where the policy meets the dirt. She hit send. And as the sun rose over the horizon, she felt something she hadn't in years, balance. For the first time since that day in Colorado, she wasn't defined by what had happened to her, or what she had survived. She was defined by what she chose to build next. Weeks later, as she boarded the flight back to Washington, a young soldier saluted her at the ramp. "Ma'am," he said, "they say you ended a battalion." Sarah smiled. "No, I helped start something better." The engines roared to life. She looked out the window as the base shrank below, rows of tents, training grounds, the place where pain had turned into purpose. And for once she didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she was already carrying it with her. Why did peace feel heavier than war? Sarah had always imagined peace as silence. No more orders, no more headlines, no more memories clawing their way into her dreams. But now, years later, as she walked the Pentagon courtyard beneath a pale autumn sun, peace felt different. It had weight. It had names. It had the ghosts of everyone who never made it this far. Her career had come full circle. She was now director of Ethical Culture Command, the office she'd once helped design from scratch. The title sounded ceremonial, but her days were anything but quiet briefings, field visits, policy fights that still smelled faintly of gunpowder. Even now there were officers who resisted her, some politely, some not at all. But most listened. That was enough. On her desk sat a photo, her old squad. Tom, Jenny, Marcus had frozen in a moment before everything broke. She kept in touch with them over the years. Tom had retired, teaching ethics at a military academy. Marcus was a drill instructor, known for being tough but fair. Jenny had opened a trauma clinic for veterans. They'd all built something from the ashes. Every few months, they met at a small diner outside D.C. The staff knew them by now. 4 soldiers who never talked about the worst days, only the roads that led them out. This time when Sarah arrived, they all stood to hug her. Jenny grinned. "Director Martinez sounds fancy." Sarah laughed. "It's still just Sarah." Tom slid her a cup of coffee. "You look tired." "I'm always tired." Marcus leaned back. "That means you're still doing it right." They talked for hours, about families, work, the young soldiers who were better trained, safer, more aware because of everything that had changed. At one point Tom asked, "You ever think about that day anymore?" Sarah paused, stirring her coffee. "Every day, but not the same way." "How that?" She looked out the window. The light hit the glass just right, and for a second she saw the reflection of 4 soldiers again, not older, not scarred, just together. "I used to remember the pain," she said quietly. "Now I remember the reason." They didn't speak after that. They didn't have to. Back in her office, Sarah found a message waiting, a formal invitation from the president to speak at the National Memorial Ceremony. The theme, Courage Beyond Combat. She sat for a long moment staring at the email. Public stages still unsettled her, but this one felt different. It wasn't about her. It was about what courage had come to mean. She typed her acceptance slowly. "I'll speak, but only if I can tell the truth." The reply came back within minutes. "That's exactly why we want you." The ceremony took place on a cold spring morning. Rows of white chairs filled the Capitol lawn. Veterans, families, dignitaries, cameras everywhere. Sarah stood at the podium in her dress uniform, medals shining softly, her posture unshakable. Behind her, the marble monuments gleamed under the rising sun. She took a breath and began. "When I first joined the army, I thought courage meant doing what you were told, marching when you were tired, pushing when you were scared. I was wrong. Courage isn't obedience. It's defiance, the quiet kind that stands up even when standing means standing alone." A hush fell over the crowd. "I was taught that strength was loud, that leaders shouted to be heard, but I learned that true strength whispers, it listens, it protects. I stand here not as a hero, but as proof that dignity can survive even when the system fails to protect it." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "The scars I carry aren't reminders of weakness. They're proof that silence lost." The crowd didn't cheer when she finished. They stood, every one of them in complete, reverent silence. And for Sarah, that silence meant more than applause ever could. Later, after the ceremony, she stood alone near the reflecting pool. The water rippled softly, carrying her reflection in scattered fragments. General Kowalski approached quietly, now retired, wearing civilian clothes but carrying the same authority in her eyes. "Never thought I'd see you give a speech like that," she said. "Neither did I." "You did good, Sarah. You kept the promise." Sarah smiled faintly. "You once told me reformers never get applause." Kowalski nodded toward the crowd dispersing behind them. "Maybe we were both wrong." They stood side by side, watching the wind move across the water. After a while the general said softly, "You ever miss the fight?" Sarah tilted her head. "Which one?" "The one that made you." Sarah thought for a moment. "I used to, but now I think the fight was just the lesson, the living after that's the purpose." The older woman smiled. "Then you've done it. You've turned pain into policy." Sarah laughed quietly, "Not sure that belongs on a poster." "Maybe it should." They both smiled, the kind of smile that only people who have bled for change can share. As years passed, Sarah stayed in her post longer than anyone expected. Her reforms became doctrine. New recruits learned about the Martinez Standard, a leadership principle built around empathy, responsibility, and respect. Every manual carried a single quote beneath the heading: "Discipline without humanity is tyranny. S. Martinez." Her name became a benchmark, but to her, it was still a reminder not of fame, but of the cost behind every line of progress. One evening, after another long day of meetings, she visited Arlington. The sun was low, painting the rows of graves in long, quiet gold. She walked without rush, boots sinking slightly into the soft grass. When she reached the memorial dedicated to unspoken sacrifice, she stopped. It was a new addition, a marble wall engraved with the names of service members who'd lost their lives to internal violence, abuse, or neglect within the ranks. At the base of the wall, someone had left a small plaque. It read, "Dedicated to those who were failed by silence, and to the one who refused it." Her breath caught. She knelt, touching the edge of the plaque. The air was cool. The wind moved through the trees like distant whispers. For a long time she just knelt there, not praying, not speaking, just remembering. As the years wore on, Sarah began mentoring younger officers, men and women who'd grown up hearing her story, but never seen the pain behind it. She told them the truth. "That day in Colorado," she'd say quietly, "I wasn't brave. I was just trying to stay alive. Courage came later when I had to keep living with the memory." They always listened. They always understood. And somewhere in those faces, she saw the future, stronger, kinder, still imperfect, but awake. On the 10th anniversary of the reforms, the Army held a private ceremony. No press, no cameras, just soldiers. They presented Sarah with a medal, the Distinguished Service Cross for moral valor. When they pinned it on her, she whispered to the young officer presenting it, "Keep it light. It's heavy enough already." He smiled nervously and she laughed. Afterward, someone asked if she'd like to say a few words. She looked around the small room, faces she didn't know but believed in. Then she said softly, "You know what I've learned? The uniform doesn't make you strong. The person inside it does, and strength isn't loud, it's steady, it's kind. It shows up every day even when no one's watching." She paused. "And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is refuse to walk away." No applause, just silence again, the kind that felt sacred. That night back in her apartment, Sarah opened her journal one last time. Most of the pages were full, a lifetime written in ink and sweat. On the final blank page she wrote, "I thought survival was the end of the story, but survival is only the doorway. Living, really living, means turning pain into something that outlasts you." She set the pen down, closed the book, and exhaled slowly. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, rhythmic, almost gentle. She walked to the window and looked out over the city lights. The same city that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like home. Her reflection in the glass looked older, calmer, unbreakable. "You did it," she whispered to herself. "Not perfectly, but enough." The next morning she woke before dawn, habit, not duty. She brewed her coffee, stepped out onto the balcony, and watched the sunrise burn the horizon gold. A new day, another chapter, even if the book was finally closing. She smiled faintly and saluted the sun, not out of ritual, out of gratitude. Because everything she'd fought, lost, and rebuilt had led here to a peace earned, not given. And somewhere, out on another base, another young woman was waking up, putting on her uniform, believing she belonged. That was enough. As the camera of the imagined film would pull back, the city shrinking beneath the morning light, the echo of her voice carrying one last time, we'd hear her final words. They kicked her in the head, but she stood back up. And when she did, 3 generals came, a unit fell, and a nation remembered what honor really meant. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The screen would fade to black. And somewhere far from the noise, a single heartbeat would go on, steady, human, unbroken. The end.